Welcome to the fifth lesson in this week, and our focus on various genres of the English Romantic period brings us to a key genre that we'll talk about today, the Gothic. Influenced by trends in architecture which date back to the 12th century across Europe, Gothicism was a version of the Romantic sensibility, a version of the Romanticism, whose interests lay in what may be called the darker side of human sentiments and passions. Gothic architecture itself may be seen in castles with turrets, labyrinthine passages, spires and dungeons. The architecture has been part of castles but also churches and other buildings. For the Romantics, this was an ideal setting for conspiracies, dark secrets in a family, ghosts and violence. Paranoia, evil and desire became the hallmark of characters in the Gothic novel. Matthew Lewis's The Monk, Horace Walpole, The Castle of Otranto, usually credited as the first Gothic novel, and an entire host of works from women authors, Clara Reeve, Maria Edgeworth and Anne Radcliffe. Texts like Mysteries of Udolpho, Anne Radcliffe's famous novel, were bestsellers in their time. The genre and mode also adopted ideas from the visual arts, most notably from works such as Henry Fuseli's The Nightmare. Coming up on your slide now, Henry Fuseli, The Nightmare, 1781. The woman in some kind of semi-conscious state, the little gnome-like horrific ugly figure sitting on her, a horse's head in a corner there, and what looked like a bunch of unguents and medical supplies on a table next to her. The woman may or may not be sleeping, may or may not be dead or unconscious. That's not the subject of the conversation here today. But texts like Henry Fuseli's The Nightmare were key elements in the making of the Gothic tradition. We have three more images for you to look at coming up now on your screen. Francisco Goya, Yard with Lunatics, 1794. Francisco Goya, Satan devouring his son. Francisco Goya, 2nd of May, 1808. What's common to all of them? What's common to Henry Fuseli, this one, and the three Goya put up for you on your slide, is the obsession with violence, but also with a clear interest in the states of the mind, paranoia, madness, mental distress, but it's also characterized by an interest in disease. The Gothic as an aesthetic mode given to certain kinds of depiction of characters, landscape and settings, and with a certain view of relationships and social order, was keen on violence. It was keen on violence of various kinds, of class tensions on the one hand, familial tensions on the other, but also the violence going on in people's minds. So there's a lot of madness in the Gothic text. And if you look at this particular image, Goya's Yard with Lunatics, you will see this. It's an image of an asylum, of mad, mentally disturbed people crowding together, behaving irrationally. Then there is the violence of 2nd of May 1808 and Satan devouring his son. The tradition of the Gothic novel is not, by the way, something restricted to the 18th and early 19th century. In the 20th century, Stephen King, Thomas Herbert, Michael Cunningham, Joyce Carol Oates have all been influenced by the Gothic. The supernatural plays a very important role in the Gothic tale. Magic, vampires, devils, assorted creatures exist. Consequently, time itself is subject to scrutiny and confusion in these texts because ghosts come from the past. So in labyrinthine passages, in attics and cellars, there are creatures from a different era in these novels. The past catches up, as it were, and there are prophecies about the future as well. So in some sense, the present seems to experience events from the past in an endless cycle of repetition, what is commonly called déjà vu. There is both unrequited and excess desire, but also madness and mental instability. Socially unacceptable desires bordering on incest, rape and violations are a common theme. The settings, like I began today's talk with, include dungeons, passages, attics, graveyards, abandoned rooms and spaces. What strikes us first about the Gothic text is the brooding atmosphere and setting. Here is a description coming up on your slide in terms of images. The first image is the York Minstrel Cathedral, which is usually described as an excellent example of the English Gothic. On the other side of the screen is an 18th century painting of Horace Walpole's Strawberry Hill Villa. Note the terrace, the spiky constructions. Why are these settings important? They're important because characters find themselves trapped in specific places, and these spaces are informed by the state of their minds. Please note what I've just said. Characters in the Gothic novel are trapped within dungeons, cellars, labyrinthine passages, but the movement through the passage modifies their mind just as the mind seems to modify the space they are in. Here is a brief description excerpted from Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. Isabella in the castle looking at her setting. Coming up on your slide now. As these thoughts passed rapidly through her mind, she recollected a subterraneous passage which led from the vaults of the castle to the church of St. Nicholas. Could she reach the altar before she was overtaken? She knew even Manfred's violence would not dare to profane the sacredness of the place, and she determined, if no other means of deliverance offered, to shut herself up forever among the holy virgins whose convent was contiguous. And then she takes a lamp and rushes through the secret passage. So she enters the passage, and here is the description continuing. The lower part of this castle was hollowed into several intricate cloisters. It was not easy for one under so much anxiety to find the door that opened into the cavern. An awful silence reigned throughout those subterraneous regions, except now and then some blasts of wind that shook the doors she had passed, and which, grating on the rusty hinges, were re-echoed through that long labyrinth of darkness. Every murmur struck her with new terror, yet more she dreaded to hear the wrathful voice of Manfred urging his domestics to pursue her. Continuing on your next slide, the movement of Isabella through the passage. She trod as softly as impatience would give her leave, yet frequently stopped and listened to hear if she was followed. In one of those moments, she thought she heard a sigh. She shuddered and recoiled a few paces. In a moment, she thought she heard the step of some person. Her blood curdled. She concluded it was Manfred. Every suggestion that horror could inspire rushed into her mind. She condemned her rash flight, which had thus exposed her to his rage in a place where her cries were not likely to come from behind. If Manfred knew where she was, he must have followed her. She was still in one of the cloisters, and the steps she had heard were too distinct to proceed from the way she had come. Cheered with this reflection, and hoping to find a friend in whoever was not the prince, she was going to advance, when a door that stood ajar at some distance to the left was opened gently. But ere her lamp, which she held up, could discover who opened it, the person retreated precipitately on seeing the light. What is this description doing? Now, note there's darkness, there's silence. The heroine is uncertain how to proceed. She's walking carefully along the corridor. Now, as you can see, the mood of the heroine and the mood of the place merge. So it's not a question of having a place that's just out there. In the Gothic novel, the place preys upon the mind, and the mind influences the places they are going through. Here is Emily encountering a landscape in Mysteries of Udolpho. You're coming up on your slide now. This is not, oddly enough, in a setting such as a building. So if you recall what we have just read in the Castle of Otranto, the woman, the heroine, Isabella, is moving through the castle, through the passages. Here, it's a description of a natural setting. Mountains whose shaggy steeps appear to be inaccessible and almost surrounded it. To the east, a vista opened. They exhibited the Apennines in their darkest horrors and the long perspective of retiring summits. As you can see, the text displayed on your slide, it's a landscape which is inducing fear. The sun had just sunk low below the top of the mountains she was descending, whose long shadow stretched athwart the valley, but his sloping rays shooting through an opening of the cliffs touched with a yellow gleam the summits of the forest. And as it proceeds, it tells you silent, lonely, and sublime. Silent, lonely, and sublime. So again, there is a solitary woman there. As the twilight deepened, its features became more awful in obscurity. And Emily continued to gaze till its clustering towers were alone seen, rising above over the top of the woods, beneath whose thick shade the carriages soon after began to ascend. The extent and darkness of these tall woods awakened terrific images in her mind, and she almost expected to see banditti as start up from under the trees. What is that passage doing? The heroine here, Emily, expects to see bandits because the setting is almost certainly meant to give her that kind of fear. So in other words, what we are looking at, and the description continues on the slide here, it's anxiety and awe-inducing, but it's primarily about terror. It's not a coincidence that the 2-volume work on the history of the Gothic novel is called the novel of terror. The heroine besieged, embattled. Here is the description of Emily now. She judged the heavy strength and extent of the whole. The gateway before her leading into the courts was of gigantic size and was defended by 2 round towers, crowned overhanging with turrets, embattled where instead of banners now waved long grass and wild plants that had taken root among the mouldering stones. Emily's heart, says the passage, sank. She seemed as if she was going into her prison. The gloomy court into which she passed served to confirm the idea, and her imagination, ever awake to circumstance, suggested even more terrors than her reason could justify. Something important here. The Gothic novel invariably had a helpless woman being chased. The undead, the ghost, the vampire are on one side, but there's also the evil spirit and the evil human being that chases the girl. So the emphasis on the virgin woman being pursued by devils, but also by other avuncular creatures from the family, such as uncles, is central to the documentation of the darker side of human nature. Now, the undead, the ghost, and the vampire are regular entrants into the plot. The Gothic showcased horror related to disease and decay, collapsing bodies, collapsing minds, the fragile mental state from in various people. Then there are rotting bodies, rotting houses, and rotting minds, but also the decaying social order and family relationships. Like I said, if you think in terms of novels, the Gothic novels, you will have the avuncular uncle or aunt or father figure who's actually pursuing the innocent, gullible heroine. The heroine's vulnerability is central to the imagining of the Gothic tale. In other cases, the familial relationships are themselves the cause of much problems. Charles Maturin's Melmoth the Wanderer is about the decaying Irish estate of the Melmoths. And in one particular episode, 2 lovers are locked up in a convent without any food. They starve to death. And the details of how they die, their cannibalism, is something documented to us by the monk who has locked them in. Here is Melmoth the Wanderer slide coming up now. The second day, hunger and darkness had their usual influence. They shrieked for liberation and knocked loud and long at their dungeon door. They exclaimed they were ready to submit to any punishment, and the approach of the monks, which they would have dreaded so much the preceding night, they now solicited on their knees. What a jest, after all, are the most awful vicissitudes of human life. They supplicated now for what they would have sacrificed their souls to avert 24 hours earlier. Then the agony of hunger increased. They shrunk from the door and grovelled apart from each other. Apart? How I watched that. This is the monk who has imprisoned the young lovers, and they're dying of hunger. Then he documents their deterioration from beings into something else. Please note what I have said. The Gothic is not an exploration only of the destruction of the human mind or of the family. It's also a destruction of the social order. Get back to the slide. They were rapidly becoming objects of hostility to each other. Oh, what a feast to me! They could not disguise from each other the revolting circumstances of their mutual sufferings. It's one thing for lovers to sit down to a feast magnificently spread, and another for lovers to crouch in darkness and famine, to exchange that appetite which cannot be supported without dainties and flattery for that which would barter a descended Venus for a morsel of food. The second night they raved and groaned, as occurred, and amid their agonies, I must do justice to women, whom I hate as well as men. The man often accused the female as being the cause of suffering, but the woman never reproached him. And then comes the key portion, and this is narrated from the jailer's point of view, the monk. She never utters a word. The third night, how shall I tell it? But you have bid me to go on. All the horrible and loathsome excruciations of famine had been undergone. The disunion of every tie of the heart, of passion, of nature had commenced. In the agonies of their famished sickness, they loathed each other. They could have cursed each other if they had breath to curse. And then comes the final climactic moment. It was on the fourth night that I heard the shriek of the wretched female. Her lover, in the agony of hunger, had fastened his teeth in her shoulder. That bosom on which he had so often luxuriated became a meal to him now. Charles Maturin, Melmoth the Wanderer. Now this is obviously a particularly graphic description of how two lovers, driven by hunger, feast upon each other because there's nothing else to do. This is the collapse of civility, of civilization, of humanity itself. Matthew Lewis's The Monk gives you another kind of graphic description, and this is the scene of the death of Ambrosio. He's been tied to a rock that feed upon him. The eagles of the rock tore his flesh piecemeal and dug out his eyeballs with their crooked beaks. A burning thirst tormented him. He heard the river's murmur as it rolled beside him, but strove in vain to drag himself towards the sound. Blind, maimed, helpless, and despairing, venting his rage in blasphemy and curses, execrating his existence, yet dreading the arrival of death, destined to yield him up to greater torments, 6 miserable days did the villain languish. On the 7th a violent storm arose. The winds in fury rent up rocks and forests. The sky was black with clouds, sheeted with fire. The rain fell in torrents. They reached the spot where Ambrosio lay, and when they abated, carried with them into the river the corpse of the despairing monk. Matthew Lewis, The Monk. Having looked at some graphic descriptions, my apologies for those of you who are squeamish, we turn to another key theme: secrecy. Secrecy is central to the Gothic. Secret knowledges, secret passages, secret relationships are a common feature. Memories and even fake memories play an important role as well. Given that it's primarily concerned with the intrusive past, these memories are of course central to how the present is lived. We have already in many ways looked at the gender theme. The heroine protagonist usually is a virgin under threat, and we have numerous such stereotypes. The woman's sexuality and a socially valuable chastity merge with questions of inheritance and property in many Gothic texts. Alan Moore's famously described a female Gothic as early as 1976, and subsequent work has unpacked the sexist patriarchal subtext to these. But the Gothic is also a hybrid genre. It has combined within itself science and superstition. A good example of the Gothic which partakes of science would be Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Patriarchal tyranny, making it a gender-specific novel, is there practically in all instances that we have looked at. Urban Gothic has appeared in the Victorian England, a little after the period we are looking at. In the 20th century, we have variations called the Cyber Gothic, which are set in technological, advanced and dystopian ages. So there are clearly subgenres in the Gothic. Some of you might be aware of Rudyard Kipling's stories, such as the Phantom Rickshaw, set in India, which are another variant of the Gothic genre. So what does the Gothic teach us? The Gothic is an exploration of psychology in terms of anxiety, fear, unacceptable desires. The Gothic is an exploration of settings such as the wild landscape, but also labyrinths, attics, cellars. There is a mutual correlation between the state of the mind and the setting. The mood determines the place, and the place determines the mood. There is unacceptable, unlawful behavior, incest, violence, the threat of rape. There is unacceptable social behavior such as cannibalism that we looked at. There is inherent violence in all families that we see here. So the Gothic as a genre is a key moment in the Romantic Age's exploration of sensibility and sentiment. It's a more violent exploration, and it's an exploration of the darker sides of human nature. Thank you.